Welcome back to the computer science classes. Subject Database Management System, Session 47, topic Exception Handling in PLSQL, which comes under Chapter 7, PLSQL. First, in this session, first you know something about exception handling in PLSQL. So this is very important here. So already you know exception. So what is meant by exception in PLSQL is nothing but error. So that's why the exception handling is also called as error handling. Exception handling is also called as error handling method. So here an error condition. So in exception particularly an error condition during a program execution called an exception in PLSQL. So an error condition during a program execution is called an exception in PLSQL. Whenever writing any program, after completion of writing, we save the program. So whenever executing or run the program, sometimes it generates some errors. So this type of errors is known as exception in PLSQL. Okay, PLSQL supports programmers to catch such conditions using exception block. So PLSQL supports programmers to catch such conditions using exception block in the program, and an appropriate action is taken against the error condition. So whenever compiler generating errors, automatically we can take some condition or action to clear the errors. Whenever I clear the errors, automatically we can see or we can generate the output. Otherwise we cannot generate the output. So whenever suppose the compiler generates errors, automatically we can clear or complete or stop the errors, and finally we get good result. That is called as error condition. It's nothing but exception handling in PLSQL. So in PLSQL it's nothing but it has some blocks. So each and every blocks we have so many different, we write so many different types of program in SQL prompt. So whenever writing a program, whenever completion of program, automatically the compiler generates the error. So that error condition during a program execution is nothing but exception in PLSQL. So here PLSQL implements runtime error handling. That implements runtime error handling through exception, through exceptions and exception handlers. You see, PLSQL implements runtime error handling through exceptions and exception handlers. We called exception handlers is nothing but who clear the errors, or who writing the programs who clear the errors. So this one is called as, and this person is called as exception handlers. So total exception can be associated with Oracle system errors. Exceptions can be associated with the Oracle system errors or with application program errors, and it contains Oracle system errors or with application program errors. So when an error occurs during the execution of a PLSQL program, when an error occurs during the execution of PLSQL program, an exception is raised. So automatically the exception is raised. It's nothing but error will be raised. Immediately program control is transferred to the exception section of the block. So immediately the program control transferred to the exception section of the block in which the exception was raised. Where the exception is raised, the program blocks is going to that particular place. So the exception is handled and the program returns to the environment. Actually we clear the error and the program returns to the environment. That called block in which the error occurred. That called the block in which the error occurred. Otherwise program control is passed on to the enclosing blocks exception handler if there is one. So if there is one, otherwise the program control is passed on to the enclosing blocks exception handler if there is one. Fine. So here exception can have two types. How many types of exceptions are there? We have two types of exceptions. The one is called system defined exceptions and the second one is called user defined exception. system defined exception, and the second one is called user defined exceptions. So what is meant by system defined exception? System exceptions means or system exceptions are raised, which are raised automatically by PL/SQL and they corresponding to the errors in PL/SQL. System exceptions are raised automatically by PL/SQL and they correspond to errors in PL/SQL or Oracle database processing. Some commonly occurring system exceptions are, what are the system exceptions? One is called cursor already opened, SQL code is equal to minus value. Suppose duplicate value on index, invalid cursor, invalid number, login denied, no data found, too many rows, value error. So these are all called system exceptions. So system exceptions. Once again, what is meant by system exceptions means are raised automatically by PL/SQL and they correspond to errors in PL/SQL or Oracle's database processing. Some commonly during system exceptions are, what are the system exceptions? What are the system errors? One is called, we'll take one example. I'll show the example. Cursor already opened. This is the one of the system exception. Duplicate value on index. Second one, invalid cursor. Third one, fourth one, invalid number. Login denied. No data found. Too many rows. Value error. So these are all called system errors or system exception. But and then another one is called zero divide is one of the system exceptions. So that contains some system variable. There are two system variables are there. The one is called SQL code and SQL ERRM. One is called SQL code and second one is called SQL ERRM. So what is meant by SQL ERRM and SQL code? So the values of the variable SQL code and SQL ERRM can be printed to see the error code and the error message associated with the error. So means the values of the variable SQL code and SQL ERRM can be printed to see the error code and the error message associated with the error. These variables are available to the any PL/SQL program as they declared in the standard package of PL/SQL. Okay, fine. So the exception section of PL/SQL block contains code to handle exception. So like we're showing some example or syntax. When exception name, then error handling code. When you are having exception name, automatically that shows the error handling. This is the system defined exceptions. And the second one is called a user defined exceptions. So what is meant by user defined exceptions? So here actually one word is there, one word that is called as user. The user has to first define the exception first. You see, the user has to first define the exception first, then an exception has to be raised at the appropriate point in the program. That's the main concept here. What is meant by user defined exceptions means the user has to first define the exception, then an exception has to be raised. Automatically the error will be raised at the appropriate point in the program. That's the appropriate point in the program. That is called as user defined exception. So I will take one syntax. I will give a syntax. Exception name exception semicolon. Exception name exception name includes exception. The exception to be raised as to the syntax rise. When the exception rises with the help of user, then that comment is rise exception name. That rise the exception name. Once again, the user has to first define the exception first, then an exception has to be raised at the appropriate point in the program. So that is called as user defined exceptions. So that is called user defined. The syntax is exception name exception semicolon. The exception to be raised as the syntax rise exception name, rise exception name. So that is called as rising the exception. Okay, fine. So I will take one simple example for exception handling here, or syntax or example. So first we can declare section, declaration section. So when you are declared, that is called as, it contains some declaration section. When begin, that contains some executable statements or executable commands. Exception, so this is the exception handling step. Exception handling goes here, so that error shows here only, the stage. When exception 1 is 1, then exception 1 handling statement. Exception is in 1, then exception 1 handling statement. What is the error that shows there only? Suppose an exception 2, then exception 2 handling statements, that is in exception 2 is has error. When exception 3, then exception handling statements like more than 1. When others, then exception 3 handling statements, and we can end the program or syntax, or we can automatically we can end the program with the help of end command. So that is called as the syntax of for exception handling. It is one of the syntax of exception handling. So next, in particularly exception handling, we're taking so many examples. Suppose we're taking employees example. So employee code is there, employee code, and then employee is there, and then one table is there, and then date of birth, department, salary. So employee code, each and every employee code has different code, 10, 15, like 12, 13. The employee name is different, and date of birth is different, department, production, research, marketing, finance different, and salary is different. So totally when can create so many rows, 5 or 6 rows. So particularly table, employee code is very important, employee salary is very important. Totally we can use a command. Suppose if you want to select anyone from employee, then we can use select star from employee. Okay, so what the about declare low salaries exception, salary employee, salary type. So next employee number, employee code. So next begin employee salary. If salary less than 6,000, rise low salary. That is called as exception. Rise low salary. Salary is very low. Else Dbms output salary is salary. We can print the salary. And if so, then we can print exception. When low salary, then Dbms output salary is very low. Select another record. Salary is very low. Select another record. So like we can declare or define user defined exceptions. That is called as the main difference between system defined exception and second one is called user defined exceptions. Okay, system defined exception and second one is called user defined exception. So next syntax for exception handling is completed. Fine. So rising exceptions. What is it by rising exception? So when you are writing any program, when you are completing any program, like I will take an example for say employees, so particularly I will take an example that the employee program. When you are writing any program that displays the name or date of birth of employee, so like whose ID is given. Already each and every employee has the particular ID is given. Since there is no employee with ID value 8 in our database or 4 in database, the program raises the runtime exception. No data found, which is captured in expression block. No data found. So I will take only for 4 employees. But I will take on 5. Oh, no data found, because that 5 employee code is not there. 5 row is not created with the help of some details. No data found, which is captured in exception block. So like rising exceptions. What is meant by rising exceptions? Exceptions are raised by the database server automatically whenever there is any internal database error, but exceptions can be raised explicitly by the programmer by using command raise. Command raise, RAISE. So this is a capital letter. You just use capital letter rising. When you're raising exceptions, when you're raising errors, if you want to raise errors, exceptions are raised by the database server automatically that will be raised the errors, okay, using database server. Whenever there is any internal database error, but exceptions can be raised explicitly by the programmer by using the command raise. Then you can use the command that is called as raise command we can use. So I will take one simple syntax and example here. So the syntax of raising command is raising exception is declare, next line exception name, then exception semicolon, and then begin. Next if condition, then I am using selection statement here. If condition, then raise exception name. Here RAISE, it's nothing but capital letter joined to small letter here. Raise exception name, you can define the exception name here, and then statement, next end, next user defined exceptions. Finally you can define the user defined exception. Here that's the simple syntax that shows the how exceptions will be raised in the program. So declare exception name exception. So next begin if condition, then raise exception name, end if exception, and exception name, then statement, and user defined exception. PLSQL allows you to define your own exceptions according to the need of your program. According to need of your program, you define your own exception. Okay, a user defined exception must be declared and then raise it explicitly. We will always declared explicitly, not for implicitly. Using either raise command. Raise command is very important here. Raise statement or the procedure Dbms standard or raise application error. This is another command. Dbms underscore standard dot raise raise underscore application underscore error. Okay, so like so I'll take as an example, declare my exception. So like another example, declare customer ID CID customers.id percentage type is assignment operator ampersand customer ID. Next line customer name, customer's name dot customer their name percentage type, customer address C address, customer address percentage type. So next automatically the comment shows user defined exceptions. So example invalid ID exception. Begin if customer ID less than is equal to 0, then raise invalid ID. Okay, 0 again that is called as with less than 0 it is called as invalid ID. Select name address into customer name customer address from customers where ID is equal to CID Dbms output we can print name. Next we can print address. And if exception, when exception invalid ID, then Dbms output print ID must be greater than 0, not less than 0. Okay, so when no data found, then Dbms output no such customer. When others, then Dbms output line error, that shows the error. So that is called as raising exceptions. So second one is called predefined exceptions. What is meant by predefined exception? So PLSQL provides many predefined exceptions which are executed when any database rule is violated by a program. PLSQL provides many predefined exceptions which are executed when any database rule is violated by a program. Fine. For example, the predefined exception no data found. The predefined exception is no data found is raised when a select into statement returns no rows, returns to no 0. For example, the predefined exception will taking no data found is raised when select into statement returns no rows. So like so the following so many tables are there, each and every table so that shows the predefined exception. So for example, predefined exception is something but access into null, Oracle error is there, SQL code is there, it raised when null object is automatically assigned a value. Access into null. What is meant by access into null? Exception is into null, but description it is raised when a null object is automatically assigned a value. Suppose case not found. It is a predefined exception. It tries when none of the choices in the when clauses of a case statement is selected and there is no else clause. Collection is null. It tries when a program attempts to any collection methods other than exits. Duplication values on index. Duplication value on index. It tries when duplicate values are attempted to be stored in a column with the Unix index. Okay, invalid cursor. It is raised when attempts are made to make a cursor operation that is not allowed. Login denied. It is raised when a program attempts to log onto the database. No data found. It rises when a select into statement returns no rows. There is no rows, okay, in table. Not logged on. It is raised when a database call is issued with the being connected to the database. Program error. It is raised when PLSQL has internal problem. Program error is nothing but internal problem. Next, row type mismatch. It is raised when a cursor fetches value in a variable having incompatible data type. Self is null. It is raised when a member method is invoked, but the instance of the object type was not initialized. Storage error. It is raised when PLSQL ran out of memory or memory was corrupted. Too many rows. It is raised when select into statement returns more than one row. Value error. It is raised when an arithmetic conversion, truncation, or size constraint error occurs. Zero divide. It is raised when an attempt is made divide a number by zero. So these are all called predefined exception. What are the predefined exception is nothing but errors. Access into null, case not found, collection is null, invalid number, invalid cursor, no data found, self is null, duplication value and index, invalid cursor, not logged on, zero divide, program error, value error, too many rows, storage error. These are all called a predefined exception. Okay, fine. So particularly in this session, if you understand something about exception handling. Exception handling is nothing but error handling in PLSQL. Exception handling, two types of exceptions. One is called system defined exceptions. Second one is called user defined exception. And then definition of system and commands and the definition of user defined command syntax and examples. Syntax for exception handling from declare to end. And then we have two types of particularly exceptions, or we can define rising exceptions and then predefined exceptions. Rising and predefined. Totally exception and error. What is meant by exception and error? It's nothing but error condition during a program execution is called an exception in PLSQL. So here we're understanding about exception. When you're using capital letter exception, that shows the error block in the program. Always each and every is always declared in the block in the PLSQL program, and that will be take appropriate action is taken against the error condition. Okay, after completion of after clearation of all the errors, automatically we can generate the output. Okay, and then there are two types of exceptions. One is called system defined exceptions and then user defined exceptions. System defined exceptions and second one is called user. And then syntax for exception handling. So declaration section begin executable commands exception 1 2 3 and then statements will be printed and others then exception 3 handling statements. So and then rising exceptions are raised by the database server automatically whenever there is an internal database error. So next, predefined exceptions. PLSQL provides many predefined exceptions which are executed when any database rule is violated by a program. Okay, thank you very much. I'll continue next session.